Let me welcome you at the event today. My name is Gráinne. I'm a political scientist at CEU Budapest, and at the same time, I'm a lead researcher at the Democracy Institute of CEU in Vienna. We have now the privilege of having an extremely attractive panel discussing Jan-Werner Müller's new book entitled Democracy Rules. Jan-Werner Müller is professor of Princeton University. He doesn't like long introductions, so let me just say that he's one of the most influential contemporary scholars of political ideologies, Christian democracy, nationalism, populism, and in general political thought. In this book that we will be discussing today, he confronts some of the most fundamental questions of democracy. And we have an extremely talented and attractive panel here who come from different disciplines to reflect on this body of work. Ferenc László from Maastricht University and Mihály Matlák from Review of Democracy put the panel together. I will introduce the speakers one by one as their intervention comes. They will speak about 8 to 10 minutes, and then I will give the floor to the author. So our first speaker is Gráinne Búrca, who is currently a professor at New York University Law Faculty after years of working at Harvard, Oxford, and EUI. Her main field of research is European Union law, and she has written widely on questions of European constitutional law and governance, human rights, and discrimination, international relations. She's also co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Constitutional Law. So, Gráinne, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to this event. It was a real pleasure to read Jan-Werner's book, Democracy Rules, very stimulating and lively and accessible read. So I want to start maybe by mentioning some of the things I really appreciated about the book and the things that resonated with me, and then maybe raise a few questions towards the end, some thoughts I had. So I was very interested in two different descriptions that Jan-Werner gave of two different types of literature, and I think I read into his descriptions a certain skepticism or distance from those. So he seems to position the book between what he calls the democracy defense industry and the democracy innovations industry. And I think, if I'm right, that the book belongs to neither really of these. It's not a robust defense of democracy as we have it as good, stop attacking it, nor here are 25 proposals for the reform of our democratic system, but it's poised somewhere in between those. And I think, if I've understood that right as the goal, I think it's been very nicely done. So I share with Jan-Werner his sense of hope rather than optimism, the sense that democracy is not over, it's not time to write the epitaph for democracy as a political system or as a political ideal, but at the same time, what he calls the critical infrastructure of democracy, the intermediary institutions which are necessary to make democracy function, are critically in crisis, as he would say, and are really severely diseased at present. So those two things resonate very much with me. I have a strong sense that democracy isn't over. There's a lot of democratic energy out there around the globe, including in non-democratic systems and failing democracies alike. And at the same time, there's a sense that something is very sick, and the critical infrastructure that he describes is ill at present. And I also very much enjoyed his, and thought he encapsulated very well something that, you know, so many countless scholars have tried to do, but his version I really think is nicely done in a pithy way. That's to encapsulate the essence of democracy in these three principles: the principle of political equality. This is a hard border for him, and I totally agree with that position. The principle of freedom, and then the third one, which is a little more complex in getting your head around it, but is absolutely essential, is the principle of uncertainty, the idea of openness, dynamism, creativity, that you cannot always have the same loser, that in order to be the essence of a democracy is that the losers change place. There can't be a permanent loser or it's not a democracy. So those are three non-negotiable essential dimensions. I also enjoyed his analysis of some of the symptoms of the sickness of our current democratic functioning in what he called the double secession. You know, the secession of the wealthiest, removing themselves from political life in common, like Peter Thiel's bunker in New Zealand, or, you know, Musk going off to the moon or elsewhere, Mars, if there's a climate crisis. And on the other hand, those at the other end of the spectrum, the disenfranchised, who've simply stopped voting, who stopped participating, who don't see themselves as part of the political system or as part of a political community. And I think maybe one comment I won't go into now, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure in the end that the recommendations towards the end really fully address the symptoms. It may be that they do. I think you say at one point they should, but certainly the trying to address and heal the critical infrastructure is a very important thing. I agree. Whether it will deal with the double secession, I don't know, but that's maybe a separate point. But it's certainly a nice analysis. And I also thought his revisiting the history of the two main intermediary institutions we have, the media on the one hand and political parties on the other, and mining that history for ideas and principles to come up with his 5 sets of principles to govern his recommendations in the last chapter was very thoughtful and interesting. You know, these principles of accessibility, autonomy, accessibility, accuracy, were they all deliberately A words? I think maybe so. That's also very interesting, these principles to break up what he calls the cartel parties, those that do create permanent losers and don't allow for a dynamism system. I also liked, even though he's disavowed the democracy innovation industry, I like the practical tone of the last chapter with some of the proposals to try to, so it's not just a diagnosis of the ills, but it's coming up with some ideas for how we might promote the health of democracy and try to fix some of the ills of the critical infrastructure. So on to where I have some questions then maybe. And I guess I might sort of broadly put it as my question is just whether the proposals are really up to the task, you know, so you very adequately diagnosed the ills, I think, many of the ills. And then where I was just less sure is whether, you know, the proposals in the end, although I agree with them, I like them all, some of them are novel, you know, for example, you borrow from the writing on novel ways of community financing or popular financing of media and political parties. I like that. I like the autocracies, the you know, new ways of thinking about militant democracy and civil disobedience and so on. They're all interesting ideas, but I did find myself wondering whether these, you know, new ways of regulating the two intermediate institutions is going to address the profoundness of the crisis. So, you know, for me, let me focus mainly on the party system. You know, the crisis in the party system is a long-standing one. And, you know, obviously you know this from your writing, and it's in the book too, although I think many might think of it as something to do with the rise of autocratic populism, but it long predates that. You know, the party system has been in crisis for a very long time, and it's been over decades. And I just found myself wondering whether, you know, my sense is that it's really a serious issue, that you know, when I envisage it in my mind, I think of a very shrunken set of institutions, you know, and I wonder whether a set of proposals to revitalize the dying, maybe that's exaggerating it, but, you know, a really kind of shriveled set of political institutions is really going to do it. It's going to be up to the task. For my own part, when I think of why do I see hope in democracy if this is so ill, where I see hope is in the social movements that we've seen in recent years. And you do mention them in the book, but they don't get a lot of attention, actually. You know, so when you think what's been really transformative over the last couple of years in democratic terms, well, the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, they have so profoundly changed things, not from above, you know, not even from below. It doesn't make sense to talk about above or below, but a very diffuse and leaderless but very powerful set of social movements have been very, obviously saying transformative is maybe saying too much because there's a long way to go, but they've done an awful lot. They've toppled powerful institutions, figures, they're changing practices, they're really challenging and they're really confrontational. So that's where I see hope. I do share with Jan-Werner the sense that, but that's not enough. You know, we do need, I completely share the premise that we need intermediary institutions. But I don't know what the intermediary institutions are that will channel that democratic energy into political decision-making and so on. And I'm not sure that the party system is it. And so maybe where I wanted to, the big question I guess I have is whether, I'm not saying you're a political scientist or a political theorist, therefore you look at the party system, but there is some sense in which we look to what we know and what is our familiar term of reference to try to create something better. But I sort of wonder whether, you know, I'm thinking here of the futurologists in some ways, whether we actually really need some innovative thinking, all of us, and I don't have suggestions right now, so I'm not in a position to criticize you for not, but whether we need to think beyond the existing institutions, which are very much in crisis, and to try to think, can we imagine new kinds of institutions? These movements have emerged and erupted without planning. Can we rise to meet them? You know, can we think about other kinds of intermediary institutions for the future? And the reason why you know, there's another point in your book, and here I come to your discussion of the media and reform of the media, which made me think that you're reluctant to move into the new, let's think innovatively afresh, because you want to take what we have and what we've always had, which has been with us over centuries and hundreds of years and really served its purpose. But, you know, when you describe the media in your chapter on critical infrastructure, you're not inclined to include social media with the traditional media. You say it doesn't perform the same function, you know, opinion forming, professional content. But towards the end, in your last chapter, I think you did come back to social media as part of the media that needs reform and so on. And I think that ambivalence you might have, if I'm reading you right, the certain ambivalence about social media and all that, is this really, you know, is it just something to take account of, or is it, I think it's more transformative than you're suggesting in your book. And I think what I was missing in your book was the profoundly transformative digital world we're living in, that the way digitization is changing everything. It's present in your book. You know, you do talk about Facebook and surveillance capitalism and social media and so on, but as separate issues here and there scattered through the chapters, and not as the sort of, the way digitization is changing our social world, our political world, our economy, the fact that we're all sitting here today having our event, you know, it's very profound, I think, in ways we're not yet fully on top of. And so I guess that's my sense, is that the problem is very deep. Political parties are in great crisis. Media is changing really dramatically, and our world is transforming very dramatically through digitization. And maybe we need to be thinking in more innovative ways about intermediary institutions. That's not very helpful of me because I don't have solutions, but I'll just put that thought out there, and I look forward to hearing your response later.
Later indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gráinne. The next speaker is Jeffrey Isak, who is professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He used to be editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics. Jeffrey is a political theorist and historian of political thought. He studied liberal progressive politics in the US, the aftermath of the post-communist revolutions, the work of Hannah Arendt, anti-communist dissidents, the concept of power, and the philosophy of social sciences. Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
I didn't realize I had done so many things. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with this fine group to discuss what is a truly excellent book. My comments are in somewhat the same spirit as the previous comments. I prepared them. I will give my prepared comments because they're timed. It's an excellent book. In Jan-Werner's words, it's returning to first principles. The book beautifully outlines the core institutions, norms, and principles that underlie modern democracies, liberal, constitutional, pluralist democracies, and why they are so important, worth both defending and extending. The book explains how democratic political regimes draw on and require infrastructural background conditions, intermediary institutions, with a focus on political parties and free and professional media institutions. And it provides a generally hopeful view of democracy's possible future, avoiding both Pollyanna-ish optimism and hopeless pessimism, and being honest about the scope for political agency, which means the scope for political judgment and political responsibility, which I think are kind of underlying themes of the entire book, and actually a lot of Jan-Werner's work more generally. The book explains the central rules of democracy, and I think kind of there are at least three meanings of the book's title. It explains the rules of democracy, it explains how and why democracy has come to rule, to the point where even its enemies feel the need to fake it. And also in the normative sense, it explains how democracy rules, in the sense in which, like, I'm tempted to say young people talk about things, at least in the United States, like their favorite musical artist rules, or their sports team rules. Democracy rules in the sense that I think, while there's not like an overheated or excessively enthusiastic advocacy of democracy in the book, it's a defense of democracy, which Jan-Werner Müller thinks, and I agree, like it's the best kind of that there is, as problematic as it is. Democracy Rules is an important book, and while I've had some disagreements, minor disagreements with its author in the past, they're very minor and they're not relevant to this discussion, I think. And there's nothing about this book with which I significantly disagree. I don't really have a critique, and I'm not going to pretend that I have a critique. I want to just offer 5 observations, which are partly, you know, a way of engaging the book, and also a way of engaging all of us and maybe our audience in thinking about this conversation, as well as the topic of the conversation, which is the book. So first, the book represents what I would describe as a mature statement by a scholar who has engaged many of these themes: the contestation of democracy in the 20th century, the meaning of constitutional patriotism, populism and its dangers, the history of ideas in the 20th century. He's engaged many of these themes in earlier scholarly work, and has always worked at the intersection of scholarly discourse and broader academic and political public spheres, publishing in a wide range of public intellectual venues. And I have found his recent contributions to Boston Review particularly important in thinking about the US context. Now, this approach to political theory is challenging. Many of us here, I think, share similar aspirations. And Jan-Werner is an exemplary practitioner. And so that's the first point I want to make. I want to note this. You know, a lot of academic political theorists don't work in this way. I think that it would be nice if some more did work in this way. And this effort to think about democracy and theorize it academically, historically, and also in a wide range of venues, very important contribution. Okay, second, both this event and the broader conversations and networks of which this event are a part are very important to the challenges we face, the challenge democracy faces, because they link scholars, teachers, and students across frontiers, and also link institutions that are arguably very important part of the infrastructure of liberal democracy. Publishing platforms such as the Review of Democracy, Democracy Seminar, and Cultura Liberalna, and academic institutions such as CEU and its New Democracy Institute, led by Laszlo Brust with the assistance of Michal Matlock and Robert Nemeth, and the New School's Democracy Seminar, spearheaded by Jeff Goldfarb, and also connected to the Transregional Center on Democratic Studies, led by Elżbieta Matynia, with the assistance of Lala Pop. I'm mentioning these people because they play an important role. And, you know, I mean, Carolina is the co-editor of Cultura Liberalna. These are very important institutions. This conversation is bringing us together. And I think it's not simply kind of like a nice personal way of chatting, but the networks and how they relate and how we can cultivate them, I think is worth thinking about. Jan's book is an occasion for us to do that, but I think the themes of the book also compel us to do this. Okay, that's my second point. The third point is, through events such as these, we can share ideas and also collaborate on common values. As Jan-Werner's book makes clear, democracy now faces dark times, real challenges, and also real challengers. And the kind of normative clarification and advocacy that the book and our work more generally promotes requires amplification as part of the broader process of educating and mobilizing citizens to commit themselves to defending and extending democracy. This is public work. It's obviously related to the writing we do as individuals and to our academic and scholarly lives. It's public work, and I think thinking about the public dimensions of it and consequences is important. And this kind of sharing is, I think, a form of solidarity, which is very valuable in some places even more than others. So one of the things about the Democracy Seminar is, you know, we're building a network of people, including people in places like Belarus or Turkey or India. In fact, a lot of places, you know, where there really is a threat, well, similar in some ways to the threat that CEU is still facing. And the solidarity dimension of this is important, but it's also related to the broader process of publicizing the importance of democracy. Okay, fourth, while Jan-Werner's conclusion offers some reasons for hopefulness, and his distinction between hopefulness and optimism is really excellent, I must say that my hopefulness is much more slender than his, and this goes to the first comments, or at least more slender than I think the rhetoric of the book, which maybe adopts a posture of hopefulness that is maybe even a little more than Jan-Werner, at least when I read some of what he writes in some places, maybe experiences. I'm deeply skeptical about whether it is possible to accomplish the kind of democratic revitalization that Jan-Werner nicely outlines, and that I wish would take place, and that I think we all support. I'm very worried. One source of worry is the ingenuity and success of some of the enemies of democracy, such as Viktor Orban. So some of you may have seen, either on Facebook or somewhere else, a piece that just dropped today at The Atlantic. It's a piece by Yasmin Sirhan. It's called The Autocrats Legacy. Defeating Viktor Orban will be hard, but undoing Hungary's democratic decline will be harder. I think that, well, that says it all. It's a really good piece, and there's hopefulness there because it's about the opposition and the possibility of a coalition. But it also underscores that the challenge is not simply to win an election that will be really difficult to win, but then to undo lots of institutional changes that have really eroded civic life and the principles of democracy that Jan is advocating. The situation in the US, I think, is particularly alarming to me and to a great many commentators and activists. And I'm involved in some activist discussions about this by some of the people that organized planned street demonstrations that never came to pass during the interregnum after the November election, but, you know, Indivisible and a lot of voter mobilization groups, which are really concerned about what's going on now in the US. The constitutional system in the United States presents so many obstacles to even elemental reforms, much less the more interesting reforms that Jan-Werner Müller talks about, and then more ambitious reforms and innovations that we might reflect on. And Trump and his Republican Party has exacerbated resentment and the longstanding failings of the party system to such an extent, and I think has succeeded in poisoning public discourse to such an extent that the chance of forestalling the Republican recapture of the national government in the next 2 and 4 years is not good. There's a very good chance the Democrats will lose the House in 2022, and that even Trump could win a presidential election in 2024. We can't take this lightly. And what it means is very, very serious and frightening. This danger is magnified by the fact that the Republicans in state houses across the country are, the term I'm using is brutally wielding their power to Urbanify the American political system and having success. And by the way, this is where I think part of the most interesting discussion of this book is, I mean, Jan-Werner's written about this, the whole militant democracy theme, which is controversial, which raises lots of different interesting issues. And to me, the most interesting part of his argument, which is very marginal in the scope of the book, is the reading of social movements and even civil disobedience movements as forms of civic militant democracy. And I do think this goes to the first set of comments. It highlights the extent to which mobilization against the forces that are very powerful really is so important to the defense as well as the extension of democracy. And this brings me to my final point, which in a way reiterates earlier points. Universities are central spaces of democratic inquiry and also the possible cultivation of civic virtue, and defending these spaces and supporting innovative forms of resistance to infringements upon them, like the infringements that CEU is experiencing, and like the innovation associated with this meeting, with the CEU Democracy Institute, with the Review of Democracy, which is a response to, in a way, I assume, to the fact that CEU was kicked out of Hungary. This is a fantastic way to respond proactively, not simply by like, keep going what you're doing, but saying, okay, and we also defend democracy. We're gonna now be active in promoting networks and public discourse. This is very important. And we need to all be supportive of this. In a similar way, I think academic institutions such as disciplinary institutions need to be revitalized so that they can address these challenges. And finally, as an academic who went to Queens College, the City University of New York, which is a public institution, and who teaches at Indiana University, which is a huge state university in the United States, where there are many huge state universities, I think our role as teachers is really, really important in terms of reaching the young minds in like legitimate Socratic ways that are completely like academically and professionally respectable, not proselytizing. But we regularly interact with hundreds of thousands, millions in a global sense, of young people who are future citizens. And the work that we do as teachers is really, really indispensable. And I think we perform civic education functions. And I'll just conclude by saying teaching books like Jan-Werner Müller's Democracy Rules and engaging our students in discussion about democracy is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Jan Kubik, professor of Rutgers University and at the same time professor of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. Trained originally as anthropologist, he is a prominent political scientist, published widely on protest politics, post-communist transformations, politics of historical memory, the interactions between politics and culture, qualitative methods in social sciences, and right-wing populism. Jan, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for this occasion, and thank you, Jan-Werner, for a wonderful book that provoked many thoughts. I will go very fast because I have quite a few points and I'll try to squeeze it into 10 minutes. So as Joel said, I am a political anthropologist, so I will be talking about those things from a slightly different angle, although I dabble in comparative politics. So I took the starting point, the three questions that were posed, which you are dealing with in a certain way. Number one, how to reinvigorate institutions essential to the success of democracy. Two, can we re-empower citizens while also having the place for experts? I think it's a very important question. And three, how can we ensure the future dynamism and creativity of democracies? So there's a number of points that I share with you, and Gráinne talked about them. I completely agree on those things, the principles, the double secession as the problem, and those things. I really like your point on the polarization, that people do not always think in the binary divisions, in-group and out-group, but I would emphasize a little bit more the point that there's a very strong tendency to do so, and the politicians mercilessly use this tendency and make it worse. On partisanship, I love that point. It does not need to be the denial of legitimacy of the other side, and it is essential for democracy. I completely agree, but how to create those limits? You can engage Chantal Mouffe, agonistic democracy. Where are the boundaries of it? And that's something I will return to if I have time. The tight relationship between internal and external pluralism. This is something that's been very close to me, and I like it a lot. But the main point is those intermediary institutions. But before I move to them, my view of those institutions, there's one thing that I would register more pessimism. You make a distinction between the fact that while the performance of democracy is increasingly negatively assessed, as we can see from many different surveys, the faith in the principles of democracy holds relatively steady. Well, I spent half of the seminar teaching the debate between Roberto Foa and Yasha Mung, those pieces they published in Journal of Democracy, and there was the whole debate about it. I find what they present more convincing than what I think is your point. I think that unfortunately, the faith in both is going down, although in other questions, in other areas, there is some source of optimism, but not maybe in this one. At least so I'm a little bit more pessimistic. Now, on to those domains. So my model of the polity is slightly different, right? And the question I pose for myself is, where do we need to focus our energy to reinvigorate institutions, re-empower citizens, and ensure future creativity of democracy? In addition, I completely take this point to political parties and the media as perhaps the most central. So I have four places. Number one, as it was already mentioned, civil society and social movements. And this is what I studied, movements and protest politics. So it's predictable that I will talk about it. But I always think, the four grand events, processes that changed the 20th century politics were movements, right? Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mandela, and Wałęsa, and the Solidarity movement, right? So there is something there, and their relationship to political parties was pretty complex. Second, there is this new book by Sidney Milkis and Dan Tishner called Rivalry and Reform, and they talk about this process of interaction between social movements and presidents in the last 100 years of American political development, right? So that again pushes me to think of this a little bit more, that those institutions outside of parties are very important. This is also important in the recent work on the state-led mobilizations in movements organized by states, like the Nashi in Russia, and so on. There's the new book, co-edited among others by Grzegorz Ekiert and Elizabeth Perry on that issue. And reading that book, I always am reminded of Bela Greszkowicz's incredibly important piece on the civic circles. When Orban was out of power, he was organizing grassroots organizations. The same thing is, by the way, was observed in Poland. So the first thing is empower and protect civil society and take care the environment for social movements. Second, again, as an anthropologist, I think about culture, obviously. So what I see, what I'm working on recently is something that I call the massive anti-enlightenment impetus. Anti-science, anti-intellectualism, anti-expert sentiments, infatuation with mythological thinking, right? That people, what is missing somehow is the rational thinking, which shows effective affinity with moderation, right? So this whole side of things is I think, extremely tenuous. I think I don't see Jan-Werner, so should I stop and wait, or?
Have you lost him?
Yeah, he's not here.
Oh boy.
Must be some technical problem in on his side.
There need to be changes in the way social media works, clearly.
I'm sure he will be back in a second.
Probably, given the fact that there's an audience and there's a time limit, and honestly, we don't even know, like, if he can come back. Maybe you should just keep going. And
okay.
People watching, this is Democracy in Action, improvised civic interaction.
Muddling through.
Okay, so then let's go ahead and have him back at one point.
Okay, so I was on the point on the significance of cultural producers. And my main point is that, like under state socialism, cultural producers, hello, I'm just repeating the main point on culture, right? That what I was saying is that under recently, the times resemble to me the state socialism, that cultural institutions are again directly involved in politics. They have become political institutions. And just think about the role of churches and religious institutions, both in this country, in the States, and particularly in Poland, but also in Erdogan's Turkey and so on, or in Modi's India. And also a hugely important thing of educational institutions, all the way from primary schools to universities. Jeffrey already talked about it, but I think this is really huge. The right-wing populists try to take over those institutions, control them, and censor them. So we need to figure out the way to make sure that the institutions of cultural, educational production are prepared to sustain liberal democracy. The third point is the dispersion of power. So I am a great fan of federalism, regionalism, empowering towns and cities. A lot of opposition to this wave of right-wing populism, many places around the world, is in the cities. Budapest has the mayor from the other side. All major cities in Poland, Constantinople is not in Erdogan's hands, and so on. So decentralization of power, I think this is, of course, the right-wing populists, they want to centralize. And finally, economy. I am also an economic anthropologist. So this is so huge, and you don't need to even talk about the mafia state, as we often talk in case of Hungary, but in our project, we have this concept of neo-feudalism, and I have no time to develop it, but basically, this is another round of finding the way to closely link politics and economy, right? So the prescription would be, again, as much as we can, let's figure out the way to impose the separation on those two in the system, given what the right-wing populists are trying to achieve by linking them together. And the final bigger point is the problems of concerns we may want to concentrate our attention on in order to get people's attention, particularly young people, which I think is a huge issue. So number one is something I would call we need to recalibrate the hierarchy of concerns and, for example, bring to the fore the climate change. This is not sufficiently high on the agenda, and it has a tremendous potential. I think that women's rights, the protection of women in general, also is a huge issue that brings to the action a lot of people. Second, we need to pay attention to generational differences. From my observations, a bit from my research, the generational differences are considerable, and young people have different sets of sensibilities. They react to things differently. They have different reference points. And sometimes there is the kind of a disconnect which produces another division in the society, which is very good for the authoritarians. Three, we need to find a way to resurrect the faith in rationalism and empiricism. At least to some degree, I am all aware about all the criticism of the Enlightenment and all of this postmodern, wave of discontent with Enlightenment and so on. But I think that I strongly believe, actually, this pendulum went way too far, and the right wing is using it. So something like called the escape from reason needs to be somehow stopped, but which doesn't mean, here you make this point beautifully, that we need to turn over power to the experts. But we need to listen to them, doesn't mean that they should run politics. I completely agree with that. Fourth point, if you are a liberal, improve your methods of listening to the people, and particularly your methods of dealing with questions of identity and tradition. Right? This is something that is really not well dealt on the liberal left-leaning side, and many people observe that, but I think it's worth repeating. And finally, I am concerned by what was diagnosed by the VDEM project as the very different form of this wave of what they call the wave of autocratization, the third wave, which is slow and gradual. And I tend to pay attention that in the slowness and gradualism, you have many more institutions than all political institutions. Hence, my insistence on taking the institutions of cultural production more seriously, because a lot of action is happening there. And I think that is something that can be done. There are people ready to engage in sort of counteraction, but perhaps this should be raised on the agenda. Those are all my points, and I really thank you again for this book and this provocation, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Our last discussant today is Carolina Vigura, who is assistant professor at Warsaw University's Institute of Sociology. She's also member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and she is on the board of the Liberal Culture Foundation in Poland. Carolina is a sociologist and a historian of ideas, mainly working on emotions in politics, stereotypes, the structure of public sphere, memory and identity in political theory, and European politics. Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and also thank you for inviting me here to share my thoughts on this excellent book. Maybe I should start with saying why this book is excellent. Although much has been said, I will just add to that one point. I do believe that the particular drama of my country and also other countries where authoritarian populists are holding power is that they have been treated since 2015 or 2016 like lost territories in some battle against authoritarian populism, when in fact those lands are a kind of an in-between land. So they are actually similar to this piece of land between the Western and Eastern Berlin between 1989. They could go in one direction or the other, and it's extremely important to grasp that, and it's extremely important to grasp that there is real political struggle going on in these countries. So this book embraces that, and I do believe that it's extremely important. And this is why, in my opinion, this is a particularly excellent book. Now, I essentially want just to ask three questions about reinvigorating democracy and its essential institutions in the context of Jan's book. The first question is actually about going back to basics. So this is a question about what basics, what principles really mean. Jan, you want us in your book to go back to principles, to basics, and to reflect not only on rules and norms, but also on values in democracy, or as some political thinkers from the past have put it in the bygone era, as you say, the spirit. So I couldn't agree more, and I would like to ask whether we could perhaps broaden a little bit this argument, broaden the understanding of the basics. This is a question which derives from one of political thinkers from the past, a political thinker that I do believe is quite near to your thinking, because he was also very much interested in intermediary institutions and also with the spirit. And of course, this is Montesquieu. So Montesquieu argued that indeed there is a spirit in every country and in every political regime. And this spirit derives from the following triad: nature, spring, and the law. Now, it's quite easy to define nature and law. Nature is simply the nature of the political regime. So who is at power? What procedures are there to decide about next steps, and et cetera, et cetera. The law, of course, is also easy to define. It's a set of rules, those written ones and those unwritten. Now, the spring has a more mysterious nature. It is passion that lays at the bottom of every regime. So you might say, it is not that passions shape politics or institutions, but they lie at the background of everything people are doing in a given political system. So can we, in your opinion, Jan, in order to reflect on how to reinvigorate our democracies, our institutions, and to empower our citizens, can we go back to principles, but also to passions? Now, my second question is about history and passions again. Painting with a broad brush, I think one might say that for roughly half a century, from the mid-1940s, in the Western countries, liberal democracy was essentially seen as a project without an alternative. Now, why was that? Partly it was because it was a way of moving away from the atrocities of the Second World War and of the first half of the 20th century in general. Partly because it was seen as a way of ensuring that the past would never come back. The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes believed that stability of a political regime derives from the symbiosis of fear and hope. So hope is not enough. It is also important to work with the dominant passion of a given day. And I think one could say that many countries after the Second World War were fearing the past and at the same hoping for a better future. And this is exactly where liberal democracy after 1945 starts. And in fact, also in my country, this escape from the past, fear of the past, played a very vital role. And I do believe this also is relevant for the whole region. Now, I mentioned Hobbes, so I should probably also say that he was aware of the fact that even the strongest collective passions fade with time. And this exactly happened with the Western democracies, including my region, so not only Western democracies. So before, there was this fear of the past and hope for the better future. And with time, the fear of the past became the fear of the future. And the hope for the better future became the hope for going back to the past. And this is exactly what authoritarian populists are working with. And this is exactly what they are using. So my first question is about, could you reflect, could you tell us what you would think the dominant passion of today is? And what ways of working with it you would suggest? So my proposal would be to speak about the feeling of loss as the dominant emotion of today. Now, let me explain what I mean here. 1989 in my region was one of these breakthrough moments in history whose impact is felt in contradictory ways. So it is as if we were reading Charles Dickens again and his beautiful book, A Tale of Two Cities, when he writes about 1789, that it was the best of times and the worst of times, the spring of hope and the winter of despair, the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. And one might say that this is exactly the ambivalent effect of 1989 in my region. So after 1989, the Central and Eastern European countries experienced extraordinary growth on almost every parameter. But change, when it happens so swiftly and completely, it involves a great loss for the individual. And of course, a lot of bankruptcies and job loss is mentioned, but what I mean is actually deeper. It goes deeper. It goes in. It means loss in the micro world of long-term relationships, identity, sources, feelings of security, etc., etc. And what is, I do believe, important here is that the same duality has been felt also elsewhere. So if 1989 marks in my region, in the region of many of us, actually, the beginning of the democratic era, then in a more global scale, it marks the beginning of an era of change and acceleration. So again, simultaneous gain and loss. I do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic, by the way, only catalyzes it more. So it brings even greater feeling of loss. Now, and the authoritarian populists understand the power of this emotion very well. And they do translate this emotion in more clear passions. So for example, rage. Think about the Capitol Hill at the beginning of 2021. Or frustration, resentment, the need for defending one's country, etc., etc. Now, liberals, of course, have very good reasons to be skeptical about feelings, and also Democrats, because they do remember the history of the Second World War, the history of the 20th century totalitarianisms, where feelings, collective feelings in particular, were often manipulated. But perhaps it might be possible to embrace the feeling of loss anyway, and to translate it into feelings or collective passions that would be better for political community. In this meaning, the collective sense of loss would be akin to the grief that follows the death of a loved one. In bereavement, our first reaction is to look back, to dwell on the loss. And perhaps this reactionary authoritarian populism is the concentration, and its concentration on the negative aspects of rapid change might be compared with bereavement. But we know, as humans, that after bereavement comes a recovery phase. So this requires, again, courage, compassion, and of course, hope that you suggest, Jan. So the last question, of course, is, you mentioned hope, and this is such essential, but perhaps it should be combined with working with dominant emotions of our collective life today. My suggestion was the feeling of loss, but perhaps you would think about other emotions, and you would share with us and talk a little bit more about this. Thank you so much for making me reflect on this, and for this particular opportunity to read this book and to comment on it.
Thank you very much to all four speakers for this very insightful comments and criticism. If, Jan, you could squeeze your response into 15 minutes, then we would have some time for rejoinders.
So first of all, let me apologize for cutting out at one point. The book, as you know, talks about the critical infrastructure of democracy, but there is still the critical infrastructure of New Jersey, and that seems to have failed for a second. So we lost electricity altogether. And I'm sorry if I missed a couple of the points that Jan was making at that moment. Secondly, let me, of course, thank Laszlo, Zsolt, Michal, Ferenc, and Robert, and the whole Democracy Institute of CEU for organizing this event. As others have already mentioned, the Democracy Institute is an incredibly important initiative. It's a place that will clearly produce important work, not just on the question of de-democratization, but also on the question of re-democratization, which in many ways might be a whole new game. Not your grandmother's or grandfather's democratization literature from the 70s and 80s. And so for those of you who are listening and watching and haven't looked at their website, haven't looked at what they're doing, I urge you to take a look and to, if you can, become involved in one form or another. Most of all, of course, thanks to everybody who joined today, who read the book, who said such kind words about the book, and who posed interesting and for me stimulating questions, to which I'll now turn in the few minutes remaining. So I'll start with a more general remark, if I may. The phrase reinvigorating democracy has come up a few times. And I'm not against reinvigorating democracy, but I suspect that that's actually a word that was chosen by my wonderful PR people for the book. I don't think it's actually in the book itself, because reinvigorating suggests a little bit the picture that one of our distinguished colleagues, David Runciman, painted when in his book, How Democracy Ends. You may remember, he says democracy might be in a kind of midlife crisis, and we kind of maybe might be looking for sort of new stimuli or new toys. And then, if I recall correctly, he even at one point flirts with the idea that Trump is kind of the red Porsche for the middle-aged man who needs a bit of a boost, and so on. That's not really my perspective. If anything, if there's a kind of intuition behind the book, it's perhaps best summed up by a distinguished political theorist who at one point said, or rather sang, the feel that it ain't exactly real, or if it's real, it ain't exactly there. Some of you may remember these lines from a song by Leonard Cohen from the early 90s called Democracy is Coming to the USA. what mattered to me in terms of this distinction between real and fake, which I understand is contestable, it's not an essentialist distinction for many people, is that it's crucial, not just sort of for reinvigorating democracy generally, as if, you know, we lost a bit of vigor and now we need a boost and so on, but that in so many contexts that many of you in this conversation today are familiar with, it's absolutely crucial to be able to draw a line between what really is crucial for democracy, what are the absolute basics, and what are more contestable issues that should be left up to day-to-day political combat. So I'll just mention two of these contexts. One is to do with the practice of journalism. So we all remember how not such a long time ago, parts of the American profession of journalism sort of basically entered the trap that had been set by Trump and Stephen Bannon, when they basically said, oh, of course, you know, the media are the opposition. And then at least some journalists rushed out and said, yes, we are the resistance, which I think was a big mistake, because in a sense then it became much easier to discredit what these journalists were doing in advance. At the same time, of course, there are moments when journalists should cease to, as we nowadays in the United States like to say, both sides the issues and basically stick to a kind of script of objectivity and neutrality that pretends that, oh, sort of all sides are in the same political space, when on occasion, one party is actually attacking democracy, and to treat it as if it weren't amounts to a serious distortion. In other words, that requires journalists on one level to become democratic theorists and decide where is that line? What actually is non-negotiable for democracy and ultimately for the exercise of their own profession? Or think of opposition parties in political systems that have been more or less captured by right-wing authoritarian populists. Sometimes they really have to, you know, explain to an electorate, look, we can disagree about a lot of stuff. Not every change to healthcare policy is the end of democracy. But there are moments when it comes to these basics, and you as citizens, even if for partisan reasons you happen to be on the other side, and you might not agree with us on many other issues, you should come around to the side of democracy. So drawing that line, deciding, you know, what's really basic and real and indispensable and what isn't, remains crucial in ever so many contexts. And the book was trying to help a little bit with the exercise of drawing that line. Okay, I'll move on swiftly to what Gráinne was saying. You're quite right to gently say that my sticking to a discussion of political parties and news organizations, etc., is a tad old-fashioned. You know, we could have discussed the same institutions 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and so on. I take the point that movements are very often absolutely crucial for, and now I use the term myself, reinvigorating democracy, for raising new claims about identities, interests, ideas, and so on. No question. At the same time, at least I don't see how some of the absolutely basic and crucial functions performed, for instance, by political parties, can be replaced by anything else. And I think that lesson was taught to us the hard way, again in the United States, on January 6th. If the Republican Party today were still a halfway normal party with a proper sort of institutionalized infrastructure, with a possibility of a critical, internal but loyal opposition, with, above all, a kind of long-term horizon where you say, look, okay, we lose this time, but you know, we're going to win again at some point in the future. Things would have been different. But if a party becomes a personality cult, and basically the time horizon is the time horizon of a man in his mid-70s, that fundamentally changes the game, and that fundamentally changes the stakes of losing and winning. So the kind of hard-nosed realism that our distinguished colleague Adam Przeworski keeps reminding us of, that look, elections have a particular function in terms of determining how strong winners and losers are, but also basically processing conflict in such a way that everybody, at least for a while, can live with these results. I think that remains valid. And if we can think of alternatives that can perform that function, things that have a similar time horizon as parties, a similar level of institutionalization, I'm all for that. But at least I don't see exactly what these alternatives would be at this point. Okay, social media. I'm glad that I now have 4 hours remaining, I think, to address this very easy subject. I'll just leave you with 2 pedantic observations and 1 concession to what Gráinne was saying. Here are the 2 pedantic observations. First of all, empirically, there is still so much that we don't really know or don't really understand. Partly because our colleagues in social science don't have access to these institutions, to the algorithms, to what really goes on in a way that, is not true of other parts of our political world. Some of the early conventional wisdom about filter bubbles and echo chambers and so on, that made sense to everybody, that led, as my colleague Andy Guess has put it, to an echo chamber about echo chambers, where we were all kind of repeating to each other this sort of obvious point. Oh yeah, on the internet, we always meet people who are like-minded and so on. It seems that empirically, this is not nearly as obvious as it had seemed for a while. And that actually our online life, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, could be much more diverse than our offline life in certain ways. So it's a very pedantic point, but I think we're still sort of jump to big conclusions about the apocalyptic threat or the emancipatory potential of what's going on, that I think is A, too broad, is B, not empirically founded enough, and that C, doesn't often distinguish well enough between the technology, particular business models, particular usages, but which still much depend on much more old-fashioned kinds of media. So yes, virality matters, but broadcasting also still matters. So in that sense, I don't feel I'm at a position to make one sort of big pronouncement this way or the other. Second, again, pedantic point is that I still like to think that at least some of the criteria I was trying to suggest in the book about how to assess intermediary institutions can be useful for how we think about social media and platforms more broadly. So just to give one example, it does matter that these institutions are relatively accessible and perhaps less anti-pluralist than some of us initially thought. But of course, this is only true at an individual level, and it's not true on a systemic level. As everybody knows, the monopoly power of these platforms in and of itself is a problem and is a threat for any democratic system, because this level of concentration of power, the fact that you basically cannot escape these institutions, even if you do something that's completely different. I mean, even if I look up a book in the Princeton library online, Google is going to be in there. Even if I have decided individually I want to have nothing to do with that, I use a different search engine and so on. So in that sense, it's something where I think some of the criteria, some of the normative expectations that we have can be usefully deployed, but we just have to be very nuanced about sort of which individual elements of all this we're looking at. Here's finally the concession. I'm certainly open to the thought that everything that I try to suggest in the book, everything that I try to say now, is still too old-fashioned, that actually the transition to what some of our colleagues now call a platform society, in other words, also a completely different architecture of institutions with completely new game of how they structure interactions, that is a possibility. And I think we see some good work on this slowly emerging beyond the kind of, again, initial sort of veering between one extreme and the other. But I'm open to the thought that the change is more fundamental than I let on in the book. But I'm not quite ready yet to simply accept that point. Jeff, just one observation about something. I agree with everything you say about the need of civic education, the need to engage. I mean, how could I not agree? One thing that I think is worth trying to understand better, again, a little bit in light of the sort of more general sense that many of us have of a kind of structural transformation of the public sphere, to coin a phrase, is the sort of the question where what you call public work really sort of happens now. What, to use a, forgive me, very neoliberal term, what exactly incentivizes what? So what I'm thinking of in particular, and maybe some of you have thoughts about this, given how many of you are engaged with public outreach and with publications and book series and online events and so on, is a phenomenon like Substack. So on the one hand, you might say, good. I mean, this empowers individuals to build audiences which otherwise, you know, they couldn't reach, and that's a very good thing. The cynic might say, okay, so we've now moved from a moment a couple of years ago, which could be encapsulated by saying democracy is dying, but you can save it if you buy my book. We've now reached the point, democracy is dying, but you can save it if you spend $4 a month subscribing to my Substack. So I think these are sort of, obviously it's a very shifting situation, and I think it'll be worth reflecting further as to what we make of the kind of institutional restructurings that enable certain kinds of work and might make other kinds of work, including the traditional work of, let's say, what used to be known as little magazines in the United States, much more difficult. To Jan's points, I just want to pick out two. I agree with basically everything you put on the table. I just want to add some complications to two of these points, in a sense to make the challenges maybe even more severe in certain ways. So I agree about the importance of decentralizing power, and if I may add as a footnote, it's something that was a real sort of learning process for me during the Trump years, that it was very interesting to see how parts also of the American left, who for obvious historical reasons felt at least ambivalent about federalism, because federalism, of course, could be understood as this is what shields racist practices in the South from interventions by the federal government and so on. You know, not the kind of most progressive or emancipatory part of the American political system you think about, how all of a sudden that looked different in, let's say, 2017, when Trump basically didn't really have to worry that much about Congress. Yeah, the media, but that was the opposition, and who cared? Millions of people marching against the so-called Muslim travel ban, but that didn't really matter either. But when California says, we're just not going to implement that, this is going to be the real sort of point of resistance, all of a sudden, for me also, it was a moment to reflect on the fact that, as you all know, the German Constitution, in its famous, or for some people maybe infamous, eternity clause, doesn't just have democracy and basic rights, it also has federalism. And occasionally, at least, Germans have said, come on, I mean, is this on the same normative level, federalism? If Bavaria disappears tomorrow as an entity, maybe less folklore and so on, but I mean, is it really that crucial? And all of a sudden you realize, well, no, it might be crucial. At the same time, of course, a lot of the old problems haven't gone away. So if you think about voter suppression and election subversion of very real threats in the US and elsewhere for that matter today, you know, one obvious thing that people always say is, okay, let's, you know, have a sort of centralized way of dealing with this process. Let's put in, you know, 10 wise technocrats, etc. To which, of course, especially some people here today would immediately object and say, are you crazy? I mean, then, you know, when the authoritarian populists capture that one institution, it's game over. Whereas now, you know, it might not be great to depend on, you know, some hitherto totally unknown official in Michigan who, after a couple of beers at night, maybe decides, yes, I'm going to save democracy, or I'm not going to save democracy. That's not really, I think, the position you want to be in. Nevertheless, it kind of did the trick, because it, you know, it may have gone the other way. So I think it's a very, very ambivalent. It's a very, very ambivalent thing, and I think it's just an invitation to think about it even more. One other thing about identity. So I'm, as you may remember from the book, I'm a little less on board with what I see as a by now, alas, somewhat typical form of liberal self-criticism that, you know, also our friend Jan Zielonka has put forward in his books. You know, we never listened. We were all these frequent flying liberal cosmopolitan elites and so on. I'm not saying that this is made up, or that you couldn't find examples, or that there isn't a reason for self-criticism. There's always a reason for self-criticism. You can never have enough of it, of course. At the same time, I think it's worth pointing out two things. One is that far too often, it then also becomes convenient to simply adopt the framing, the cultural framing of these issues by the right wing or even the far right. Because there's a kind of strange irony in this. If you adopt it and then you are contrite and then you basically say, look, we gotta talk to every single white man in a Midwestern diner to really understand the grievances and so on and so forth. In a perverse way, you adopt, that framing, but also in a perverse way, it sort of confirms the importance of self-declared liberal elites. It's all about us, right? So because we neglected something, it went this way. If only we did it differently, it will go the other way. And maybe the hard truth is actually that, a lot of what is attacked by right-wing or even sometimes far-right populists, yes, is important, but actually we might be looking in the wrong place in terms of how we could get out of some of the difficulties or rot we're in at the moment. And then second brief remark, as the book also tries to make clear, I'm not entirely on board with the view that is frequently articulated by at least some of our colleagues today, namely that democratic politics has become inherently more difficult or more conflictual or polarized because we nowadays talk more about identity than we used to. I think this is completely ahistorical. I think it sort of conjures up a mythical age where socialist parties were only about slightly higher wages or better working conditions, had nothing to do with identity, dignity, cultural ways of life, and so on. Completely false, of course, as a historical picture, but also more generally, the notion that anything to do with identity is automatically more difficult to negotiate, I think at least is worth rethinking. I'm not denying that, on occasion this can be the case. But if you think about some of the movements that Gráinne mentioned, so Black Lives Matter, Me Too, you can also think about some of the issues at stake at questions of distribution. So who has which rights? Who gets to enforce which rights? This isn't really about, let me try to understand, all the manifold subtleties of somebody's collective experience. I mean, that matters too, of course, for the sake of mobilization, for the sake of empathy, for all kinds of reasons. But to basically sort of say, as soon as we go anywhere close to questions of identity, it becomes so much more difficult. If you think of, this is somebody who I think is rarely read anymore, but if you think of Gabriel Tarde, so the contemporary of Durkheim, basically said the opposite, and I think for good reasons. That basically, no, actually, people can shift their identities quite often. You make some adjustments, you see yourself in a somewhat different light. That's not always that difficult. But material redistribution, I think we've kind of forgotten how hard that it can be, because it's not really been on the table. I mean, this is, again, one of the things one would worry about in the US, the way you say, look, we have an incredibly radicalized Republican Party, but actually during decades of, for lack of a better term, neoliberalism, nobody has really ever tried to take that much away from, the upper 10% or whatever, however you want to slice the cake. What the hell is going to happen if we actually get close to real issues of material redistribution and so on and so forth? Anyway, I'll leave it at that and swiftly move on to Carolina's very good, which is to say difficult question about passions. So on the one hand, I'm kind of reluctant to go there because I worry that as important as Montesquieu's emphasis on collective mentalities is, it can very easily be instrumentalized by people, and you've all heard these people, and you probably hear them day and night, who tell us stories along the lines of, well, it's so bad that Europe is so culturally divided. Our poor cousins in Central and Eastern Europe, of course, they're inherently more illiberal. They never really got used to multiculturalism. They only had so few years to understand democracy. So these are all these sort of differences in mentality, and that really explains why, unfortunately, these guys have Kaczynski and Orban, but we're on the safe side over here because, of course, we're so much more progressive and emancipated and so on. So it can vary. I mean, I'm not saying you did that, of course, but I think it's always very tricky to engage this in a way that doesn't sort of slide down towards, more or less cliched observations about different Búrca cultures. So I would take it in a slightly different way, but it takes up your invitation to think about the effects of the pandemic. So I would say that collective passions, if they exist at all, have something to do with collective experiences. And collective experiences, of course, are never quite the same. But whether they are felt to be similar or maybe even identical is something that is decisively shaped by political actors. What do I mean? I think we're in a moment that's somewhat similar, of course, to the post-2008 moment. You all recall that for a brief moment, socialists, social democrats, etc., all said, oh, financial crisis, that's the end of neoliberalism. Now it's going to go our way. You know, it's obvious that there's going to be some massive reaction in favor of good old social democratic policies. We all know what happened instead. We all know that, I would say at least, that the movement slash party that, at least in the American context, most successfully made use of the financial crisis in terms of symbolic politics and then also institutional politics happened to be the Tea Party, which nobody had quite imagined could be there or could have the kind of impact it did. And so again, today you might say, look, there's a kind of vacuum. This is still up for grabs. In a sense, we did have a rare, truly collective experience. But how that's understood is a question for movements and also, again, in a very old-fashioned way, political parties. So let me just mention two aspects of this that might resonate with you, or maybe you might find very implausible. Think of the fact that however different our particular circumstances have been, at least for a moment, there was a sense, look, there are certain things we just couldn't do because of certain restrictions. You just couldn't buy certain things, you couldn't have certain experiences, and so on. It simply was prohibited. Now, you might say that's actually kind of the experience for many people of poverty every day. So freedom isn't just money, but money is also freedom. And obviously it can be obscene if we now pretend that, oh yeah, of course, we were in the same position as, you know, a large family in a small flat in some public housing and so on. Of course not. Nevertheless, there is something that everybody experienced on one level. Or think about the fact that some of you may remember the essay by Jean-Marie about old age. Very, very tough reading because it's a completely disillusioned piece that basically says old age means that your horizons close in, that basically you no longer sort of have a sense of the world being open to you, waiting for you, this sort of stuff. But of course that was de facto, you know, no matter how big a frequent flyer you were beforehand of many people during the pandemic. Again, I'm not equating these things. My point is, if you have political imagination, you can work with this material. And if you say that, oh, but this is so disparate, you can't do that, then think of the fact that during the Second World War, the experience of a British aristocrat who could retreat to their country home was also very different from a worker who was sent to the front. And nevertheless, there was a Labour Party that said, we're going to transform this collective experience into a collective agenda that is going to justify a welfare state. I know it was more complicated than that, but I think this is sort of how the point about collective experience, maybe collective passion, including, as Carolina rightly said, experiences of loss or vulnerability might become a particular kind of political program. But that, as everything else in politics and in democracy, is contingent, is up to how particular actors will react, and it's also a question of time, because time is slipping away fast, both for doing this and for me to say anything. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you all again very much for your observations about the book and your kind words about it too.
Thank you very much indeed for this great presentation that was structured around the questions raised by the members of the panel. Indeed, we have no time for continuing the discussion here, but we can urge everybody to buy the book. And let me express my gratitude to you for this fascinating discussion, to the CEU's Democracy Institute for making it possible. And let's meet in the bookshops.
Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Now I'm being like institutionally self-interested. So I wanna just say that the Democracy Seminar is debuting a new website soon, and like within a week probably, or 10 days, and it's going to feature a symposium on the book that Gráinne edited called The End of the Liberal Mind, which is about Polish politics. It's a really interesting book. The symposium is interesting, and hopefully Gráinne and other contributors will follow up with comments. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, sure. So let's say close on this positive note, and let me thank again Jan-Werner Müller for allowing us to discuss a great book. Thank you very much.